The flight attendant was fired for theft during a flight, and the millionaire asked her a question. Her answer made him fall to his knees. Emily Collins straightened her Navy uniform one last time before walking down the aisle of the first-class cabin. 7 years as a flight attendant for National Airways had taught her how to spot trouble before it started. The politician in 3A was on his 4th scotch, while his wife in 3B hadn't touched her champagne, preferring instead to fiddle with the diamond bracelet adorning her wrist. "Can I get you anything else, Mrs. Harrington?" Emily asked, offering her practiced smile. The woman glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "No, thank you. Just make sure no one disturbs us for the remainder of the flight." Emily nodded and continued her rounds, unaware that this routine flight to Atlanta would be her last. 2 hours later, as passengers disembarked, Mrs. Harrington's shrill voice cut through the cabin. "It's gone. My diamond bracelet is gone." Security was called. The plane was searched, and somehow, impossibly, the bracelet was found in Emily's locker. "I didn't take it," Emily insisted, her voice shaking as she stood before the airline's HR director, Susan Donovan. "Someone must have planted it there. I would never." "The evidence is quite clear, Ms. Collins," Susan interrupted, her voice cool and professional, betraying none of the triumph she felt inside. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for theft. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." Just like that, 7 years of perfect service records meant nothing. No investigation, no chance to defend herself, just the humiliation of being escorted from the building by security while former colleagues averted their eyes. 3 months later, Emily's knees ached as she scrubbed the floor of Charleston Regional Airport's small terminal. The irony wasn't lost on her, spending her days watching planes take off and land while she cleaned the floors that passengers walked across without a second glance. "Emily, break time," called Marge. The 60-something supervisor who'd shown Emily unexpected kindness since her first day, in the cramped break room, Emily unwrapped her homemade sandwich and checked her phone. A text from her brother. "Got an A on my bio midterm, med school. Here I come." She smiled despite herself. At least something good was coming from all this. The money wasn't much, but combined with her depleted savings, it was keeping her brother in college and covering her mother's medical bills. Another text appeared. "Mom's doctor wants to try a new treatment. Insurance won't cover it, $3,000. I'm sorry, Emily closed her eyes, fighting back tears. $3,000 might as well be $3 million. Her wrongful termination lawsuit against National Airways was moving at a glacial pace, with expensive lawyers finding every possible way to delay proceedings. "You okay, honey?" Marge asked, settling into the chair across from her. Emily wiped away a tear. "I'm fine. Just tired. You had that dream again, didn't you?" Marge had become something of a confidant over the past months. Emily nodded. The same nightmare had plagued her since childhood. Falling through clouds, screaming for parents whose faces she couldn't see, the deafening sound of metal tearing apart. "I don't know why they're getting worse," Emily admitted. "Ever since I lost my job, it's like they're more vivid, like they're trying to tell me something." After break, Emily returned to her cart of cleaning supplies. Through the large terminal windows, she watched a sleek private jet taxi toward the hangar. Another wealthy executive, probably, flying in for a weekend of golf or sailing. Emily tried not to feel bitter. She'd once loved the sky, found freedom in it. Now it just reminded her of everything she'd lost. That evening, Emily trudged up the stairs to the modest 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her mother. The place smelled of antiseptic and the cheap air freshener she'd picked up at the dollar store. "Mom, I'm home," she called, setting her bag down. Her mother's reply was weak. "In here, sweetheart." Margaret Collins sat propped up in bed, surrounded by pill bottles and a half-finished crossword puzzle. Once vibrant and active, the past year of treatments had hollowed her out, leaving her skin paper-thin and her once bright eyes sunken. "How was work?" Margaret asked, reaching for Emily's hand. "Fine," Emily lied, squeezing her mother's fingers gently. "How are you feeling?" "Dr. Patel called," Margaret said instead of answering. "He mentioned a new treatment. I told him we'd need to think about it." Emily sat on the edge of the bed. "I saw Jake's text, $3,000. "Forget it," Margaret said firmly. "We're not dipping into your brother's college fund. It's not just his fund, Mom. It's for emergencies, too." "This isn't an emergency. It's just another treatment that probably won't work." "Don't say that," Emily whispered. Margaret's smile was tired but genuine. "My practical girl, always fighting battles for everyone else." She reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "You're just like your father that way." Emily stiffened slightly. Her adoptive father had died when she was 15, but something in the way her mother mentioned him always felt off, as if there were words unsaid, histories untold. Later that night, after ensuring her mother had taken her medication and fallen asleep, Emily sat at their small kitchen table. Bills spread before her: the apartment rent, utilities, insurance copays, her brother's tuition installment, and now, somehow, an additional $3,000 she needed to materialize out of thin air. She pulled out her phone and reluctantly opened the email she'd been avoiding. A former colleague, now avoiding her like she carried some contagious disease, had mentioned that National Airways owner, the reclusive Charles Donovan, was returning to the States after years abroad. Word was he'd be implementing major changes. Maybe, just maybe, if she could speak to him directly, explain her situation. But that was a fantasy. Men like Donovan didn't speak to wrongfully terminated flight attendants. They had layers of security, assistants, and lawyers specifically to avoid such encounters. Emily closed her laptop and walked to the window. Outside, a plane's lights blinked against the night sky. Her hand unconsciously moved to the medallion she always wore, a simple silver disc. Unremarkable, except for the intricate pattern etched into its surface. She'd had it for as long as she could remember, though she didn't know where it had come from. Her mother always changed the subject when Emily asked about it. As she watched the plane disappear into the distance, Emily had no way of knowing that the owner of that medallion would soon walk back into her life, or that the dreams plaguing her sleep were not dreams at all, but fragments of memories fighting to surface after 20 years of darkness. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose window frame, a sound not unlike the metal tearing in her dreams. Emily shivered, suddenly cold despite the warm evening air. Sometimes she felt like she was still falling, even when her feet were firmly on the ground. The sleek private jet touched down on the tarmac of a sunlit airstrip just outside New York City. Charles Donovan gazed out the window, observing the Manhattan skyline in the distance, 5 years away, and the city skyline had changed, much like the man himself. "Welcome home, sir," the pilot announced over the intercom. "Local time is 2017 p.m., clear skies and 72 degrees. Charles nodded absently, already scrolling through emails on his tablet. At 49, his dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, lending him a distinguished air that complemented his tall frame and penetrating gray eyes. Years of negotiating international business deals had taught him to hide his emotions behind a carefully composed mask of polite indifference. But today, as his private car whisked him toward the National Airways headquarters, that mask slipped just slightly. 5 years ago, he'd left America behind. Unable to bear the constant reminders of his failure, now he was back with a single purpose: to fulfill a 20-year-old promise to the only man he'd ever truly respected. "Find her and protect her," Henry had said, his voice barely audible over the hospital machinery keeping him alive after they'd pulled him from the wreckage. "She carries our secret." Charles had searched. God knows he'd searched. But the girl had vanished without a trace. Eventually, running the company Henry had built became Charles's way of honoring his memory, even if he'd had to do it from afar. The car slowed as it approached the gleaming glass tower bearing the National Airways logo. Charles straightened his tie and steeled himself for what was to come. Susan Donovan paced her corner office, phone pressed to her ear. "I don't care what it takes. Delay the lawsuit further. That girl can't set foot in this building again." She paused, listening. "No, Charles doesn't know about it. No. And he won't. Just handle it." She ended the call and turned to the window, surveying the empire she'd spent years quietly consolidating under her control. Her half-brother might own the majority share, but in his absence, Susan had become the de facto ruler of National Airways. She'd made herself indispensable. And she wasn't about to let anyone, certainly not some flight attendant with an uncanny resemblance to a ghost from the past, threaten that. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Donovan, Mr. Donovan has arrived. He's waiting in the main conference room." Susan took a deep breath, checking her reflection in the glass. At 46, she was still striking, with sharp features and darker hair than her half-brother, kept in a sleek, chin-length bob. She straightened her designer suit and headed for the door, a practiced smile already in place. "Charles, what a wonderful surprise," she exclaimed, entering the conference room where her half-brother stood examining a model airplane display. The dozen executives seated around the table looked on nervously. Charles turned, his expression inscrutable. "Hardly a surprise, Susan. I informed the board of my return 3 weeks ago." Susan's smile didn't falter. "Of course, I meant the timing. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow's meeting. I prefer to understand situations before discussing them formally," Charles replied, his tone pleasant but firm. "I've spent the morning reviewing our financial statements." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Susan gestured toward an empty chair at the head of the table. "Well, you're here now. Shall we begin?" For the next 2 hours, Charles systematically dismantled the narrative Susan had carefully constructed over the years. Questionable expense accounts, declining service ratings, high turnover among staff. By the time he finished, several executives were visibly sweating. "Tomorrow's board meeting will address restructuring plans," Charles concluded. "Until then, I'd like access to all personnel files and complaint records from the past year." Susan's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. "Personnel files? Surely HR can provide a summary." "All files, Susan," Charles repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "On my desk by morning." As the meeting dispersed, Susan lagged behind, catching Charles alone. "You look good," she said, forcing warmth into her voice. "Europe agreed with you." "Hong Kong." "Primarily," Charles corrected. "And I wasn't there for the climate." Susan studied him for a moment. "Why now, Charles? After 5 years, why come back?" A shadow passed over his face. "Let's just say I had a reminder of unfinished business." Before Susan could press further, Charles's phone rang. He glanced at it and frowned. "My pilot, excuse me." Susan watched him step away, her mind racing. What unfinished business? And what did it have to do with personnel files? 3 hours later, Charles's jet was unexpectedly circling Charleston Regional Airport, a small facility that wasn't on his original itinerary. "Sorry for the diversion, Mr. Donovan," the pilot explained through the intercom. "JFK reported severe congestion due to weather systems moving in. We need to wait it out or find an alternate route to Atlanta." Charles sighed and massaged his temples. The headache that had started during the meeting with Susan was intensifying. "How long will we be on the ground?" "At least 2 hours, sir. We need to refuel anyway." "Fine," Charles conceded. He could use the small airport's facilities to continue reviewing files away from Susan's watchful eye. The jet taxied to a remote area of the small airport as Charles descended the stairs to the tarmac. The warm southern air hit him like a physical presence after the artificial cool of the cabin. A ground crew member directed him toward the terminal, explaining that the small executive lounge was currently being renovated. "Regular terminal okay for you, sir. It's quiet this time of day." Charles nodded his thanks and headed inside. His leather briefcase in hand, the terminal was indeed mostly empty, with only a few travelers scattered among the plastic seats. He found a quiet corner and settled in, opening his laptop to continue working. 20 minutes later, movement caught his eye. A young woman in a cleaner's uniform was methodically working her way across the floor, pushing a mop with practiced efficiency. Something about her posture, the way she held herself despite the menial task, caught Charles's attention. She turned slightly, and Charles froze, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It was a gesture he'd seen 1,000 times before, Henry's gesture. And as she looked up, responding to something a supervisor called out, Charles caught a glimpse of her profile. The resemblance was undeniable, not just to Henry, but to the photographs Charles had seen of Henry's wife, Eleanor. This young woman had Eleanor's delicate features combined with Henry's determined set of the jaw. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet, before he could think better of it, Charles was on his feet, moving toward her. She looked up as he approached, wariness instantly replacing the distant expression she'd worn moments before. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone professional but guarded. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking, but it was something else that confirmed Charles's suspicion. A small silver medallion partly visible beneath her uniform, identical to the one Henry had always worn. "You're Emily Collins," he said, Surprised to hear his voice sounding so calm when his heart was racing, her eyes widened slightly. "Do I know you?" "No," Charles replied. "But I know you. You were a flight attendant for National Airways." Emily's expression hardened. "If you're from legal, I have nothing to say without my attorney present." "I'm not from legal," Charles said quietly. He extended his hand. "My name is Charles Donovan. I own National Airways." Emily's face went pale. The mop handle slipped from her grasp, clattering against the freshly cleaned floor. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles looked at her, at the woman who had once been Grace Whitmore, daughter of his mentor and friend. Working as a cleaner in a small regional airport, everything he had planned to say vanished, replaced by a single burning question. "Why is an exemplary flight attendant like you working here?" Emily regarded Charles Donovan with disbelief, her posture stiffening. "Why am I working here?" she repeated, her voice gaining strength despite her shock. "Because your company fired me without cause and blacklisted me from every major airline." Charles frowned. "I'm not aware of any—" "Of course you're not," Emily cut in, bending to retrieve her fallen mop. "I'm sure firing flight attendants is so far beneath your notice it doesn't even register." Something in her defiance struck Charles, the same unbending integrity he'd admired in Henry. Before he could respond, Emily's supervisor called out from across the terminal. "Collins, everything okay over there?" Emily raised a hand in acknowledgement. "Fine, Marge. Just finishing up." She turned back to Charles, her eyes hard. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Donovan. Unlike some people, I can't afford to lose my job," as she began to walk away. Charles called after her. "May I speak with you when your shift ends?" Emily paused, torn between wanting nothing to do with this man and the slim hope that he might actually listen to her side of the story. "I finish at 7, she said finally, without turning around. "There's a diner across the street." Charles watched her go. A storm of questions swirling in his mind. Blacklisted, fired without cause. None of this matched the company policies he'd established. He pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Rebecca, I need you to find a personnel file. Emily Collins, former flight attendant, terminated approximately 3 months ago. And I need it now." Meanwhile, Susan Donovan sat at her desk in New York, staring at her computer screen where a dossier on Emily Collins was open. The phone on her desk rang, displaying her assistant's name. "What is it, Michael?" "Miss Donovan. Someone from Mr. Donovan's office just requested Emily Collins's personnel file." Susan's blood ran cold. "When?" "Just now they said Mr. Donovan needs it urgently." Susan shut her eyes, thinking quickly. "Send them the sanitized version, the one we prepared for legal." "Yes, ma'am." Susan ended the call, her mind racing. Why was Charles asking about Emily Collins? Had someone tipped him off? She picked up a small remote from her desk drawer and pressed a button. The office windows instantly frosted over, ensuring complete privacy. From a hidden compartment in her desk, she withdrew a tattered photograph. A handsome couple smiled back at her. Henry and Eleanor Whitmore on their wedding day. Susan had carefully cut herself out of the picture years ago, removing the evidence of her standing beside them, her face tight with barely concealed jealousy. It had never been supposed to happen like this. 20 years ago, when she'd first approached Sean Matthews with her idea, it was supposed to be simple, just a small mechanical issue with Henry's private plane, enough to scare him, to make him realize how fragile life was, enough perhaps to make him turn to her for comfort. She hadn't known Eleanor would be on the plane too, and she certainly hadn't planned for both of them to die. Susan returned the photograph to its hiding place, her hands trembling slightly in the chaotic aftermath of the crash. She'd been named temporary guardian of 8-year-old Grace Whitmore. Charles had been overseas, unreachable for the critical first 72 hours. By the time he returned, wild with grief, the child was gone, given to a suitable family outside the industry, where she could heal from her trauma away from constant reminders of her parents. In reality, Susan had paid the adoption agency an enormous sum to place the girl with a family in another state, to change her name, to make her disappear. Grace Whitmore became Emily Collins, and Susan breathed easier, knowing the secret she and Sean shared was safe, until, 20 years later, a young woman with Henry's mannerisms and Eleanor's eyes walked into National Airways. Looking for a job as a flight attendant, Susan hadn't recognized her initially. It was only during a company gala, when she'd watched Emily adjust her hair behind her ear with that distinctive gesture of Henry's, revealing a small crescent-shaped birthmark, that the truth had hit her with the force of a physical blow. The discovery that Emily wore Henry's medallion, the one he'd always claimed contained a family secret, had confirmed Susan's worst fears. She had orchestrated Emily's firing immediately, using the bracelet theft as convenient cover, and now Charles was asking questions. Susan picked up her phone again. "Michael, book me on the next flight to Charleston." Back in Charleston, Emily managed to avoid Charles for the remainder of her shift, taking her cleaning cart to the far end of the terminal. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, she had half convinced herself he wouldn't show up at the diner. Yet there he was, sitting in a booth by the window, jacket removed and sleeves rolled up, looking through a file with such intense concentration, he didn't notice her approach. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Charles looked up, quickly closing the folder. "Mrs. Collins, thank you for coming. It's not like I had a lot of other dinner invitations from billionaires tonight," Emily replied dryly. A waitress approached, pouring coffee without being asked. "The usual, Em." "Thanks, Dottie." Charles ordered a black coffee, waiting until the waitress departed before speaking again. "I've been reviewing your file. Let me guess. It says I'm a thief who stole a passenger's diamond bracelet. Actually, it's surprisingly vague. States you were terminated for violation of company policy, but contains no incident report, no witness statements, nothing." Emily's surprise must have shown on her face because Charles continued. "That's not how I run my company. Ms. Collins, every termination, especially one involving alleged theft, should have extensive documentation." "Well, tell that to your HR director," Emily said. "She's the one who fired me on the spot." "Susan fired you personally," Emily nodded, describing the events of that day. Charles listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker. "And you filed a wrongful termination lawsuit." "Tried to, but your lawyers keep finding reasons to delay. Meanwhile, I can't get hired by any airline because I've been flagged in some industry database as having ethical concerns." She stirred her coffee absently. "So here I am, working for minimum wage while my mom's medical bills pile up and my brother tries to stay in college." Charles was silent for a moment. "I'd like to help you, Ms. Collins." Emily laughed without humor. "Now, after 3 months of your company dragging me through the mud, why should I believe you?" "Because something isn't right here," Charles said quietly. "And because—" He stopped himself, uncertain how to explain the real reason he was sitting across from her in this dingy diner. How could he tell her that she was the spitting image of his dead friend, that the medallion around her neck was identical to the one Henry had worn every day of his life? That 20 years ago, he'd made a promise to protect a little girl who had vanished without a trace. "Because what?" Emily pressed, studying his face. "Because I believe you," Charles said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Emily's gaze remained skeptical, but something in his tone must have reached her. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Donovan?" "First, I'd like to formally reopen the investigation into your termination," he said. "Second, I'd like to offer you a temporary position as my administrative assistant while we sort this out." "You want me to work for you?" Emily's eyebrows rose. "The man whose company destroyed my career." "With me," Charles corrected. "And yes, it provides you with income, gives you access to help clear your name, and—" He hesitated. "Allows me to make things right." Emily studied him for a long moment. There was something Charles wasn't telling her. She could sense it, but the urgency of her situation didn't leave much room for pride. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. "This isn't just about me. I have responsibilities." Charles slid a business card across the table. "My private number? Call me tomorrow with your decision." As Emily took the card, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist. Charles's breath caught, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. It was her. It had to be. After 20 years, he'd finally found Grace Whitmore. Emily spent a restless night weighing Charles Donovan's offer. By morning, pragmatism had won over pride. Her mother needed that new treatment, and her brother's tuition payment was coming due. With shaking hands, she dialed the number on Charles's business card. He answered on the second ring. "Donovan, it's Emily Collins, about your offer." 2 days later, Emily found herself in the back of a sleek town car headed to the Charleston Marriott, where Charles had set up a temporary office. She smoothed her only business-appropriate outfit, a navy skirt and white blouse she'd worn to court appearances, and tried to calm her nerves. The hotel suite had been transformed into a working space, with laptops, files, and a makeshift conference area. Charles greeted her with a professional handshake. "Ms. Collins, thank you for coming. Let's be clear," Emily said, foregoing pleasantries. "I'm here because I need the job, and because clearing my name matters to me. This isn't about doing you a favor." Something like admiration flickered in Charles's eyes. "Understood. Shall we begin?" The morning passed in a blur of administrative tasks, with Charles observing Emily's efficiency with quiet approval. Around noon, his phone rang, checking the display. His expression hardened. Susan. What a surprise. Emily froze at the name, her hands hovering over the laptop keyboard. "Charleston, what brings you here?" Charles's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes narrowed. "No, that won't be necessary. I'm handling things personally." After another moment, he added, "Actually, I've hired a temporary assistant to help sort through these files. You might remember her, Emily Collins." Even from across the room, Emily could hear the sharp intake of breath from the other end of the line. "Yes, that Emily Collins," Charles continued, watching Emily's reaction. "I'll see you at dinner, the hotel restaurant, 7 o'clock. He ended the call and turned to Emily. "My sister seems quite surprised by your employment." "Half-sister," Emily corrected automatically, when Charles raised an eyebrow. She explained, "Everyone at National Airways knew that, Ms. Donovan makes sure people understand she's only half related to the owner." "Interesting," Charles murmured. "What else did everyone know about Susan?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to say. "That she's protective of her position, that crossing her is career suicide. And yet here you are, working directly for the one person she can't intimidate. Is that what this is about?" Emily asked, anger flaring. "You're using me as some pawn in a power struggle with your sister." "No," Charles said firmly. "This is about justice and truth. But I won't pretend my sister's involvement in your termination doesn't raise questions." Emily stood abruptly. "I need some air." Outside on the hotel balcony, Emily tried to calm her racing thoughts. Was she just trading one powerful manipulator for another? The sound of the sliding door announced Charles's approach. "I apologize if I upset you," he said, joining her at the railing. "Why me?" Emily asked, turning to face him. "With all the problems in your company, why focus on one wrongfully terminated flight attendant?" Charles looked away, watching a plane cross the sky. "Sometimes injustice finds us when we're looking for something else entirely. That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Emily felt a strange connection, as if she'd known this man much longer than 2 days. The feeling unsettled her, and she quickly looked away. "I should get back to work," she said across town, in another hotel suite. Susan Donovan was on the phone with Sean Matthews. "He's hired her, Sean, as his assistant." On the other end of the line, the former pilot turned politician cursed. "How the hell did he even find her?" "I don't know, some cosmic joke of fate." Susan paced the room. "If he figures out who she is..." "He won't," Sean interrupted. "It's been 20 years. Even if she looks like them, there's no proof. All records of Grace Whitmore were sealed after the adoption." "There's the medallion," Susan reminded him. "A trinket, meaningless without context. And the birthmark." Sean sighed audibly. "Susan, get a grip. Charles may be suspicious, but he can't prove anything. And if he starts asking too many questions, well, that's why I'm calling. I need your help with an airport contract, and you need me to stay quiet about certain past events." Susan stopped pacing. "Are you blackmailing me?" "I prefer to think of it as mutual self-preservation. My campaign needs that airport security contract, and the selection committee trusts your judgment on vendors. And if I refuse, then I might start remembering details about a certain night 20 years ago, how you were so obsessed with Henry that you..." "Stop," Susan hissed. "I'll see what I can do." After ending the call, Susan stared at herself in the hotel mirror. The face that looked back was still attractive, still commanding, but she could see the strain around her eyes, the tightness in her jaw. For 20 years she'd carried this secret. And for what? Henry had never loved her. Not even when they were teenagers and she'd worshipped him from afar. The medallion. She'd thought it meaningless when she'd let the child keep it. Just a family heirloom with sentimental value. It wasn't until years later, overhearing Henry tell Charles about a family secret hidden in plain sight, that she'd realized her mistake. And now Charles and Emily, no, Grace, were together. The pieces moving inexorably toward a truth Susan had buried for 2 decades. Back at the hotel, Charles watched Emily work, conflicted about his next move. Part of him wanted to tell her everything immediately. Who she really was, what had happened to her parents, the promise he'd made. But without concrete proof, would she even believe him? Or would she think him delusional? Perhaps even dangerous. The lawsuit gave him legitimate reason to investigate Susan's actions. But he needed more. He needed access to the medallion, to confirm it was Henry's. And he needed to find the old family doctor who could verify the birthmark's significance. "We should prepare for dinner," Charles said, checking his watch. "Susan will be looking for any excuse to undermine you." Emily looked up from the laptop. "I can handle Susan Donovan. I don't doubt it, but we need to be strategic. She doesn't know what we know about the lack of documentation for your termination. So what's the plan? We observe. We don't reveal what we're investigating, and we watch her reaction to seeing you with me." Emily closed the laptop, her expression troubled. "This feels like more than just clearing my name now." Charles met her gaze steadily. "It is, but I promise you, Emily, when this is over, you'll have more than your reputation back." "What does that mean?" Before Charles could answer, his phone rang again. He checked the display. "It's the private investigator I hired to look into your case. Excuse me." As Charles stepped away to take the call, Emily stared after him, increasingly certain she was stepping into something far bigger than a wrongful termination case. The way Charles looked at her sometimes, as if he were seeing someone else, someone he'd lost, sent chills down her spine. Yet despite her reservations, she couldn't deny the strange sense of trust she felt toward him. It was irrational, illogical even, but something deep inside her recognized Charles Donovan as, what? An ally, a protector. With a frustrated sigh, Emily rose to prepare for dinner, unaware that across the table from her that evening would sit the woman who had orchestrated not just her firing, but the destruction of her entire former life. The hotel restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversations of business travelers and tourists. Emily and Charles arrived precisely at 7, finding Susan already seated at a corner table, a glass of white wine in hand. "Charles?" Susan smiled, rising to embrace her half-brother. Her eyes flicked to Emily, the smile never reaching them. "And Mrs. Collins, what a surprise." "Is it?" Charles asked, pulling out Emily's chair. "I mentioned she would be helping me during our call." "Yes, but I assumed as a file clerk or something similarly appropriate." Susan's gaze traveled over Emily's outfit, clearly noting its modest quality. "Not as your personal assistant." Emily met Susan's gaze evenly. "I assure you, Miss Donovan, I'm qualified. 7 years of managing difficult situations in confined spaces at high altitudes taught me quite a bit about handling pressure." Charles suppressed a smile, as Susan's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Let's order, shall we?" he suggested, signaling a waiter. The meal progressed with superficial pleasantries, but Emily could feel Susan studying her, searching for weaknesses. When the main course arrived, Susan turned the conversation to business. "Charles, the board is expecting your restructuring plan tomorrow. Shall I tell them you need more time, given your distractions?" Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward Emily. "The plan is ready," Charles replied. "But before we implement it, I'd like to understand why employee satisfaction has dropped 18% under your HAR leadership, particularly among female staff." Susan's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Market pressures have forced difficult decisions. Not everyone adapts well to change." "Interesting," Charles mused, "because I've been reviewing termination records, and there seems to be a pattern of exemplary female employees being dismissed for vague policy violations, especially those positioned for advancement." Emily watched Susan's knuckles whiten around her wine glass. "If you're implying something based on one disgruntled former employee's claims, I'm not implying anything," Charles interrupted smoothly. "Just noting patterns. Data doesn't lie, Susan." The tension was broken by Susan's phone ringing. She glanced at it and stood abruptly. "Excuse me, I need to take this. As Susan walked away, Emily leaned toward Charles. She's rattled. Good. Charles watched his sister's retreating form. Tonight was about letting her know we're looking into patterns, not just your case. Her reaction confirms we're on the right track. Emily studied him. There's more to this than clearing my name, isn't there? Before Charles could answer, Susan returned, her composure restored. I apologize, but I need to cut dinner short. There's a situation at headquarters requiring my attention. On a Saturday night, Charles raised an eyebrow. The airline business doesn't respect weekends, as you well know. Susan gathered her purse, then paused, looking at Emily's neck. That's an interesting medallion, Miss Collins, family heirloom. Emily's hand instinctively went to the silver disc visible at her collar. Something like that. I've had it since childhood. May I? Susan reached toward it. Emily hesitated, then reluctantly leaned forward, allowing Susan to examine the medallion without touching it. Unusual design, Susan commented, her tone casual though her eyes were intent. Almost like a key. It's just a pattern, Emily said, tucking the medallion back under her blouse. Susan's smile was thin. Of course, well, good night to you both. After she departed, Emily released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Why was she so interested in my medallion? Charles's expression was troubled. I don't know, but I intend to find out. Later that evening, Charles insisted on driving Emily home. I'd like to speak with your mother if that's possible, he explained. Emily frowned. My mother's health isn't good. She tires easily. I understand, but her perspective on your situation might be helpful. Emily reluctantly agreed, and soon they were pulling up to her modest apartment building. Inside, Margaret Collins was having one of her better evenings, sitting up in the living room watching television. Mom, Emily called. We have a visitor. Margaret turned, her eyes widening as Charles entered behind her daughter. Even weakened by illness, Margaret Collins maintained a quiet dignity, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. Mr. Donovan, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. My daughter mentioned you'd offered her a position. Please, call me Charles. He took the seat she indicated. And yes, Emily's assistance has already proven invaluable. Margaret studied him with the same direct gaze Emily often employed. You're a long way from corporate headquarters, Mr. Donovan, to be personally investigating a wrongful termination case. Charles smiled. You're very direct, Mrs. Collins. Emily must get that from you. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes. Some traits are learned, others inherited. Emily has always had a strong sense of justice. That came built in. The conversation continued, with Charles asking polite questions about how long they'd lived in Charleston. While Emily excused herself to make tea, when she returned, she found her mother relating stories of Emily's childhood. So independent, even as a young girl, though the nightmares were difficult. Emily set the tea tray down with a little too much force. Mom, I'm sure Mr. Donovan isn't interested in my childhood dreams. Actually, Charles said, I find it all fascinating. He accepted a cup of tea. Your home is lovely, Mrs. Collins. Do you play? He nodded toward the upright piano tucked into the corner of the small living room. Margaret shook her head. That was my late husband's. He tried to teach Emily, but she never had the patience. May I? Charles asked. Standing? Of course, Margaret replied. Charles moved to the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys before sitting down. After a moment's hesitation, he began to play, a gentle, haunting melody that seemed to fill the small apartment with an unexpected poignancy. Emily froze, teacup halfway to her lips. The melody. She knew it. But how? She'd never heard it before. And yet, images flashed through her mind. A grand piano in a sunlit room, a man's hands guiding hers over the keys, a woman's soft laughter, little Grace's lullaby. A voice called it. But whose voice? The teacup slipped from her fingers. Shattering on the hardwood floor, Charles stopped playing immediately. Emily, are you all right? She stared at him, her face pale. What was that song? Just something an old friend composed, Charles said, his eyes intent on her face. You recognize it? Emily shook her head, disoriented. I don't know, it seemed familiar somehow. Margaret was watching them both, her expression unreadable. Emily, you're trembling. Perhaps it's time to thank Mr. Donovan for visiting. Charles stood, his gaze still on Emily. Of course. I've imposed enough. He turned to Margaret. Thank you for your hospitality. Mrs. Collins? At the door, Charles paused. The melody. It was called Wings of the Heart. My friend composed it for his daughter. Emily's breath caught. Wings of the Heart, she repeated softly, the phrase echoing strangely in her mind. After Charles left, Emily turned to find her mother watching her with tears in her eyes. Mom, what's wrong? Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. Sit down, Emily. There's something I should have told you long ago. What are you talking about? Margaret touched Emily's medallion gently. That song he played. You used to hum it in your sleep, those first few months after you came to us. Emily stared at her mother, uncomprehending. After I came to you, what does that mean? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You were already 8 years old when we adopted you, Emily. We didn't tell you because the doctors said your mind had blocked out the trauma, and it was better to let you heal. The room seemed to tilt around Emily. What trauma? What are you saying? I don't know all the details, Margaret whispered. Only that there was an accident. The lady who brought you to the agency paid a lot of money to keep things quiet. She said it was for your protection. What lady? What accident? Emily's voice rose in panic. Margaret shook her head. I don't know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. We wanted to tell you when you were older. But by then, you seemed so settled, so happy. We didn't want to reopen old wounds. Emily touched the medallion at her throat, suddenly seeing it with new eyes. Not a random keepsake, but a connection to a past she couldn't remember. The song, she whispered. Wings of the Heart. Outside in his car, Charles sat with his hands still on the steering wheel, his heart pounding. Her reaction to the melody confirmed everything. Emily Collins was Grace Whitmore, and somehow, against all odds, he'd found her. Now he just had to help her remember who she really was, before Susan realized what was happening, and silenced them both. Emily barely slept that night, her mother's revelation echoing in her mind. Adopted at 8, a mysterious accident, the melody that felt so hauntingly familiar. None of it made sense, yet it explained the disjointed fragments of memory that had plagued her dreams for years. By morning, her confusion had crystallized into determination. She needed answers, and Charles Donovan seemed to have at least some of them. She reached for her phone to call him, but it rang before she could dial. Emily, it's Charles. How are you feeling? Like my entire life has been a lie, she replied bluntly. We need to talk. I agree. But first, I have news. I've located Dr. William Garner, formerly the Whitmore family physician. He's retired now, living outside Atlanta. I'm flying there this morning to speak with him. I'm coming with you, Emily said, her tone brooking no argument. A brief pause. I'll send a car in an hour. 90 minutes later. They were airborne in Charles's private jet. Emily stared out the window, watching Charleston recede beneath them. My mother's condition worsened overnight, she said without preamble. The doctors say it's pneumonia. They've admitted her to the hospital. Charles glanced up from his tablet. I'm sorry? Emily, is there anything I can do? You can tell me the truth. She turned to face him. You know who I really am, don't you? Charles set the tablet aside, his expression grave. I have a theory, but without proof. I don't care about proof right now. I care about truth. Emily's voice trembled slightly. Last night, you played a song that triggered memories I didn't know I had. My mother, my adoptive mother, told me I was already 8 when they took me in, that there was an accident, and some woman paid to keep my adoption quiet. Charles was silent for a long moment. 20 years ago, my business partner and closest friend, Henry Whitmore, died in a plane crash along with his wife Eleanor. Their 8-year-old daughter, Grace, supposedly died with them, but Henry lived long enough to tell me otherwise. His last words to me were, "My daughter survived. Susan hid her. Find her and protect her. She carries our secret." Emily's breath caught. You think I'm Grace Whitmore? I do. Charles met her gaze steadily. The way you tuck your hair behind your ear, exactly like Henry did. The crescent birthmark on your wrist. A Whitmore family trait going back generations. And the medallion you wear. identical to the one Henry never took off. Emily's hand went instinctively to the silver disc at her throat. But why would Susan hide me? And why can't I remember any of this? The trauma of the crash could explain the memory loss. As for Susan, Charles's expression darkened. I've spent 20 years trying to understand that myself. The plane descended toward Atlanta, leaving Emily lost in thought. If what Charles believed was true, then the nightmares that had haunted her for years weren't dreams at all, but fragments of memory struggling to surface. Dr. William Garner's home sat on a quiet street in an Atlanta suburb, its well-tended garden reflecting its owner's meticulous nature. The doctor himself, a dignified man in his 70s, opened the door at Charles's knock. "Charles Donovan," he said, recognition and surprise mingling in his tone. "It's been, 15 years? At least," Charles replied, shaking the older man's hand. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice." Dr. Garner's gaze shifted to Emily, and something like shock flashed across his face. "My God," he whispered. Inside, once they were seated in his study, the doctor continued to stare at Emily. "The resemblance is remarkable. You have Eleanor's features, but Henry's eyes. Then you believe she's Grace Whitmore?" Charles asked. "Doctor?" Garner leaned forward, studying Emily's face. "May I see your left wrist, young lady?" Emily extended her arm, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark. "The Whitmore mark," the doctor confirmed. "Every member of the direct bloodline bears it. Henry had one in the exact same location." He sat back, visibly shaken. "We all believed you died in that crash, child." "I don't remember it," Emily admitted. "I don't remember anything before the Collinses adopted me. Traumatic amnesia, not uncommon in children who've experienced something horrific." Dr. Garner turned to Charles. "But how did you find her after all these years?" Charles explained the coincidence of Emily working for National Airways, her subsequent firing, and their chance meeting at the Charleston airport. "Susan fired her personally," he finished, which raises disturbing questions about how much Susan knows. Dr. Garner's expression grew troubled. Susan Donovan always had an unhealthy fixation on Henry, even as teenagers. When he chose Eleanor instead, well, Susan didn't handle rejection well. Emily leaned forward. "Are you suggesting Susan had something to do with the crash?" "I'm not suggesting anything," the doctor replied carefully. "But I remember treating Susan for what she claimed was a nervous breakdown after the funeral. She kept repeating, 'It wasn't supposed to happen like that.' At the time, I attributed it to shock and grief." A chill ran through Emily. "Dr. Garner, do you know what my medallion means?" Susan seemed very interested in it. The doctor nodded. "Henry commissioned that medallion when Grace was born. He called it the Wings of the Heart, the same name as the lullaby he composed for you. He was very protective of it, said it contained a family secret that would be revealed when the time was right." "But what secret?" Emily pressed. "That I'm afraid Henry took to his grave, or so we thought, Doctor." Garner's gaze settled on the medallion at Emily's throat. "Perhaps the answer has been with you all along." By the time they returned to the jet, Emily felt overwhelmed by the weight of revelations. She was Grace Whitmore, daughter of Henry and Eleanor, presumed dead for 20 years, and now it seemed possible that her parents' death had been no accident. "What now?" she asked Charles as the plane lifted off. "Now we find concrete proof," he replied. "Something that will stand up in court if necessary." Emily nodded absently, her thoughts on her mother, her adoptive mother, lying in a hospital bed in Charleston. "I need to get back, Margaret's condition." Her phone rang, interrupting her. The caller ID showed the hospital. Emily answered, her heart racing. "Miss Collins, this is Dr. Patel. Your mother's condition has deteriorated significantly. You should come right away." The next few hours passed in a blur. Charles redirected the jet to Charleston and had his driver rush them directly to the hospital. Emily found Margaret in the IQ, an oxygen mask obscuring most of her face. Her brother Jake sat beside the bed, his expression bleak. He said, rising to hug her. "She's been asking for you." Emily approached the bed, taking Margaret's frail hand in hers. "Mom, I'm here." Margaret's eyes fluttered open. Focusing with effort, she gestured weakly for the nurse to remove the oxygen mask. "Emily," she whispered, "my brave girl. Save your strength, Mom," Emily urged. Margaret shook her head slightly. "No time. Must tell you." Her breathing was labored, each word an effort. The woman who brought you to us? Elegant, wealthy, paid cash, so much cash, for us to take you and never speak of your past. Emily leaned closer. Who was she, Mom? Do you remember her name? Never said her name, but... Margaret's voice faltered. But I found something after you went to bed last night, hidden in my old jewelry box all these years. She gestured weakly toward her purse on the side table. Jake retrieved it, and Margaret directed Emily to a small zippered compartment inside. There, wrapped in tissue paper, was a business card, yellowed with age. Emily unfolded it, reading the name printed in elegant script. Susan Donovan, Vice President of Human Resources, National Airways. On the back, handwritten, remember our agreement. Her past stays buried, or there will be consequences. Emily stared at the card, ice flooding her veins. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Protecting you, Margaret whispered. Always protecting you, she seemed. Dangerous. Her eyes drifted to Charles, standing quietly in the doorway. But he found you anyway, didn't he? Just like the elegant lady said he would someday. Emily squeezed her mother's hand. What do you mean? What did she say about Charles? Said a man would come looking for you someday. Said he'd claim to be your guardian. But he was dangerous. Margaret's breathing grew more labored. But I see how he looks at you. Not dangerous, protective, like a promise kept. Margaret's eyes closed, her breathing growing fainter. Forgive me, Emily. Should have told you, years ago. There's nothing to forgive, Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. You've been the best mother anyone could ask for. A faint smile touched Margaret's lips. Then, with a soft sigh, she was gone. The days following Margaret's death passed in a fog of grief for Emily. The funeral arrangements, the well-meaning visitors, her brother's quiet devastation. All of it felt surreal, disconnected from the person she thought she was, the person she was discovering she had been. Charles remained a constant, silent presence, handling details Emily couldn't bring herself to face. He'd postponed his return to New York indefinitely, working remotely from Charleston while Emily mourned. A week after the funeral, Emily found herself sitting across from Charles in his hotel suite, Susan's business card placed between them on the table like a loaded weapon. She lied to me my entire life, Emily said, breaking the silence. Told your sister she would keep me hidden, keep my past buried, all while I was having nightmares about falling through the sky, about people I couldn't remember. Her voice cracked. I spent 20 years not knowing who I was. Charles studied her, concern evident in his eyes. Margaret loved you, Emily. She was trying to protect you the only way she knew how. I know. Emily wiped away a tear. But now I need the truth. All of it. Charles nodded, his expression grim. Susan must have recognized who you were when you applied to National Airways. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. And when she did, she fabricated a reason to fire me, Emily finished, to get me away from the company, away from anyone who might recognize me, away from you. Yes, but she didn't count on us meeting anyway. Emily's hand went to her medallion, a habit she now recognized as more than just nervous fidgeting. It was a connection to her true father, to the man who had given it to her, who had somehow known it would be important. Dr. Garner said my father believed this contained some family secret, she mused. I've had it for 20 years and never found anything special about it. Charles leaned forward. May I? He asked, gesturing to the medallion. After a moment's hesitation, Emily removed the chain from around her neck and handed it to him. Charles examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. The silver disc was unremarkable at first glance, etched with an intricate pattern of swirling lines that resembled wings surrounding a heart. Henry wore one identical to this, Charles murmured. Said it was a Whitmore family tradition, passed down through generations. He pressed gently along the edges. There must be something. I've tried everything, Emily said. It doesn't open, doesn't change, doesn't do anything except hang around my neck. Charles continued examining it, his frustration growing visible. Finally, he set it down with a sigh. Perhaps the secret isn't in the medallion itself, but what it represents. Emily reached for it, slipping the chain back over her head. Or perhaps my father was just being poetic. She stood abruptly. I need to clear my head. Care to walk with me? They strolled through a nearby park, the Charleston afternoon warm. Despite the early spring date, Emily found herself studying Charles, trying to reconcile the powerful businessman with the man who had dropped everything to help her. "Why have you stayed?" she asked suddenly. "You have a company to run, a board meeting you've postponed twice now. Why are you still here with me?" Charles was quiet for a moment. "I made a promise to your father as he was dying. I swore I would find you and protect you. For 20 years, I believed I'd failed him. Failed you." He met her eyes. "I'm not leaving until I've kept that promise." Something in his intensity, his unwavering dedication to a decades-old vow, stirred Emily deeply. The connection she'd felt since their first meeting suddenly made sense. He was the link to her past, to her true self. "Charles," she began. Her words were cut short by the sharp ring of his phone. Charles checked the display and frowned. "It's my investigator," he answered, listening intently. After a brief exchange, he ended the call, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Emily asked. "Sean Matthews, the pilot Susan was involved with 20 years ago. He's in Charleston, meeting with Susan at the Belmont Hotel right now." Emily's pulse quickened. "The pilot, from my parents' plane." "Yes, he left aviation after the crash, went into politics. He's a state senator now, with ambitions for national office." Charles checked his watch. "If we hurry, we might catch them together." The Belmont Hotel's elegant lobby bustled with well-dressed guests. Charles and Emily found a spot near the bar that offered a view of the restaurant without being obvious. "There." Charles nodded toward a corner table. "Susan and the man in the gray suit." Emily observed them carefully. Susan looked tense, while the man, Sean Matthews, appeared to be pressing some point emphatically, his hand occasionally striking the table for emphasis. "They're arguing," Emily whispered. Charles nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'm having my security team run a background check on Matthews's recent activities. There must be a reason they're meeting now after all these years." As they watched, the argument intensified. Sean suddenly stood, leaning over the table toward Susan, his face contorted with anger. Susan appeared to plead with him, her hand reaching for his arm. He shook it off violently, nearly knocking over his water glass. "I should get closer," Charles said. "Try to hear what they're saying." "No." Emily grabbed his arm. "They'll recognize you instantly. I'll go. They're too heated to notice me." Before Charles could protest, Emily was moving through the lobby, using other guests as cover. She positioned herself at the bar, close enough to catch fragments of the increasingly heated exchange. "Not what we agreed," Matthews was saying. 20 years of silence, Susan. 20 years of watching my back, and now you want more." "I'm not asking for much, Sean," Susan hissed. "Just your support on the security contract. A simple endorsement. Nothing is simple with you." Matthews's voice dripped contempt. First it was just scare him a little. Then it became, make sure the sabotage can't be traced. Your obsession with Henry Whitmore cost 2 people their lives. "And now you're trying to drag me back into it." Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Sabotage. 2 people. Her parents. "Keep your voice down," Susan snapped, glancing around nervously. "Or what?" Matthews challenged. "You'll arrange another accident. I'm not that naive pilot you manipulated anymore." "Susan, I have my own power now, and I have evidence that could destroy your precious political career with one phone call," Susan countered. "Or have you forgotten who actually tampered with that fuel line?" Matthews's face went rigid. "We're done here." He stood, throwing his napkin onto the table. "Stay away from me, Susan. Next time you call, I'll go public with everything." As he stormed toward the exit, Susan remained seated, her face a mask of controlled fury. Emily retreated quickly, rejoining Charles before either could spot her. "What did you hear?" Charles asked, noting her pale face. "Enough," Emily replied, her voice shaking. "They sabotaged my parents' plane. Susan planned it, and Matthews carried it out. They murdered my parents, Charles." Charles's expression hardened. "Let's get out of here before Susan sees us." Back in Charles's car, Emily related the conversation in detail, her hands trembling with shock and rage. "We need proof," Charles said grimly. "Their word against ours won't be enough after 20 years. The medallion. Emily said suddenly, clutching it through her blouse. Susan kept asking about it. What if it really does contain evidence somehow? In her agitation, Emily tugged sharply at the chain. It caught on a button of her blouse, and as she tried to free it, her fingers slipped, striking the medallion against the car's center console with unexpected force. A soft click, barely audible, made them both freeze. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered. Carefully, she removed the medallion, examining it in the fading afternoon light. A thin seam had appeared around its circumference, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. With trembling fingers, Emily pried at the edge. The medallion split open, revealing a tiny hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a small, ornate key. "Wings of the Heart," Emily breathed, recalling her father's melody, the name now taking on new meaning. The medallion's pattern wasn't just decorative. It was a stylized key with wings. Charles stared at the key in wonder. "Henry's private safe," he said. In the old Whitmore mansion, everyone thought the key was lost in the crash. Emily closed her fingers around the small key, feeling its weight, the weight of truth, of justice long delayed. "Take me there," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Take me to my father's house." Susan Donovan's hands shook as she poured herself a third drink in her hotel suite. The confrontation with Sean had gone worse than she'd anticipated. After 20 years of mutual silence, their fragile pact was unraveling just when she needed it most. Her phone rang. Michael, her assistant in New York. "What is it?" she snapped. "Miss Donovan, there's been unusual activity on Mr. Donovan's corporate account. He's accessed the original architectural plans for the old Whitmore estate." Susan nearly dropped her glass. "When?" 20 minutes ago, and there's more. He's ordered the security system deactivated for tonight. "Thank you, Michael, that will be all." Susan ended the call, her mind racing. The Whitmore mansion. Charles was taking Emily there. But why? What could possibly? The medallion. Susan cursed herself for not confiscating it years ago. Henry had been obsessive about that trinket, wearing it constantly, fingering it during tense meetings. She'd thought it merely sentimental when she'd let the traumatized 8-year-old keep it after the crash. But what if it was more? What if it contained something that could link her to the sabotage? With shaking hands, Susan dialed Sean's number. He didn't answer. She left a terse voicemail. "They're going to the Whitmore mansion tonight. Whatever Henry hid there, they're about to find it. Call me back." The Whitmore estate stood on 5 acres outside Atlanta, a stately Georgian mansion that had been in Henry's family for generations. After his death, Charles had purchased it, unable to bear the thought of strangers living in his friend's home. He'd maintained it exactly as it had been, a monument to the family he'd failed to protect, as their car wound up the long driveway. Emily stared out the window, fragments of memory stirring, the grand oak at the entrance, the circular fountain. The sense of coming home was so powerful, it brought tears to her eyes. "I know this place," she whispered. Charles glanced at her, hope flaring in his eyes. "Your memories are returning." Flashes. Impressions. Emily pressed her hand against the window. "My mother's rose garden was there, and my swing hung from that oak tree. Inside, the house was quiet, preserved like a museum." Charles led Emily through rooms that sparked more fragments of memory. The dining room where she'd sat on books to reach the table. The library where her father had read her stories. His study was upstairs. Charles said softly, "That's where the safe would be." They climbed the grand staircase, Emily trailing her hand along the banister. At the top, she paused, her head tilting as if listening. "This way," she said suddenly, turning left with certainty. "I remember." She led them to the master suite, then through it to a smaller room beyond. Henry's private study, dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, a massive desk by the window. Emily moved as if in a trance, drawn to a large portrait on the wall, Henry and Eleanor Whitmore, with a small girl between them. "That's me," Emily breathed. "And my parents." Charles nodded, watching her rediscover her past. "Henry commissioned that painting for your 7th birthday." Emily touched the frame reverently, then stepped back, scanning the room. The safe, where would it be? Henry was traditional. Behind a painting, perhaps? Emily shook her head. No, Dad was cleverer than that. She closed her eyes, summoning elusive memories. Music. There was always music in this room. Her eyes snapped open, and she crossed to a beautiful antique record player in the corner. Here? It's here somehow. Charles joined her, examining the cabinet beneath the turntable. There's no visible keyhole. Emily ran her fingers along the wood grain, feeling for inconsistencies, finding none. She stepped back, frustrated. Think, Emily, she murmured to herself. Wings of the heart. What does it mean? Her gaze traveled back to the family portrait, to the small heart-shaped locket visible at her child self's throat, then to the record player. Heart, music, wings, the lid, she said suddenly. Help me lift the lid of the record player. Together they raised the heavy wooden top. Underneath, where the turntable mechanism attached to the cabinet, was a small heart-shaped depression, a keyhole disguised as part of the design. With trembling fingers, Emily inserted the tiny key from her medallion. It fit perfectly. A soft click, and a panel slid open in the cabinet below, revealing a hidden safe. It's keyed to my father's fingerprint, Emily said, the knowledge surfacing from some deep recess of memory. But there was an override. She reached in, finding a small panel with numbers. A code. What would it be? Your birthday, perhaps, Charles suggested. Emily tried it. Nothing happened. No, something more meaningful to Dad. She thought for a moment, then entered another date, 10/15/97. The safe clicked open. What's that date? Charles asked. The day he finished composing Wings of the Heart, Emily replied, the memory crystal clear. Now, he played it for me that night for the first time. Inside the safe were several items, legal documents, a small leather journal, and a USB drive. Emily removed them carefully, her hands shaking. The journal was Henry's private diary. Emily opened it, finding entries dating back years. She flipped to the final pages, her breath catching as she read her father's last entries. Susan's obsession has grown disturbing. Today I found her in my office again, going through my personal files. When confronted, she claimed to be leaving budget reports, but her behavior was erratic. I've asked Charles to investigate discreetly. And later, I've installed cameras in my private plane after finding evidence of tampering during the last maintenance check. If someone is attempting sabotage, I'll have proof. The footage uploads automatically to a secure server. I've hidden the access credentials where only Grace might someday find them if something happens to me. Charles will know what to do. Emily looked up at Charles, her eyes wide. The USB drive. They connected it to Charles's laptop. It contained only a single file, a text document with a web address, username, and password. It's an access portal to a secure server, Charles said, typing rapidly. If we can connect. The screen filled with file listings, dated 20 years earlier. Charles clicked on one, and grainy security footage appeared. Henry's private plane in a hangar, and a figure in maintenance coveralls working on something near the fuel line. The figure turned, and the camera caught his face clearly. Sean Matthews, Emily whispered. They watched in horror as Matthews methodically created a slow leak in the fuel system, one that would develop gradually during flight, leading to catastrophic failure. As he finished, a second figure entered the frame. Susan Donovan, instantly recognizable even 20 years younger, handed Matthews an envelope. They spoke briefly, their expressions grim but determined. Evidence, Charles said softly. After all these years, Emily sat back, overwhelmed. They murdered my parents, and they would have killed me too if I'd been on that plane as scheduled. Why weren't you? Charles asked. I had strep throat, Emily replied, the memory surfacing clearly now. Mom was going to stay with me, but Dad needed her at a business dinner. My nanny stayed instead, her hands clenched into fists. A sore throat saved my life. Charles was already on his phone. I need my legal team immediately, and contact the FBI's white-collar crime division. He paused, listening. Yes, evidence of conspiracy to commit murder from 20 years ago. And tell Roberts to increase security at the mansion. No one enters or leaves without my explicit approval. As Charles continued making calls, Emily returned to the family portrait, staring into the faces of the parents who had been stolen from her. The diary, the video evidence, the truth, preserved by a father who somehow sensed the danger around him. "I remember you now," she whispered to the painted figures. "And I promise, I'll make this right." Outside the mansion, concealed by darkness, Susan Donovan sat in her rental car, watching the lights in Henry's study. She'd arrived too late to stop them from entering. Now all she could do was wait and plan her next move before everything she'd built over 20 years came crashing down around her. 3 days after discovering the evidence in the Whitmore mansion, Emily stood beside Charles in the expansive boardroom of National Airways headquarters. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Atlanta's skyline provided a dramatic backdrop to what promised to be an explosive meeting. "Are you ready for this?" Charles asked quietly. Emily smoothed her navy blue suit, new, purchased for this exact moment, and touched the medallion at her throat. "I've been ready for 20 years. I just didn't know it." The boardroom doors opened, and executives began filing in, their curious glances darting between Charles and the unfamiliar woman at his side. Among the last to enter was Susan Donovan, her composure perfect save for the slight narrowing of her eyes when she spotted Emily. "Charles," Susan greeted, her voice controlled. "I wasn't aware you were bringing a guest to our board meeting." "Not a guest, Susan," Charles's voice carried across the room, causing conversations to halt. "An heir?" A murmur swept through the assembled executives. Susan's smile remained fixed, though her complexion paled slightly. "What an intriguing statement," she said. "Perhaps you'd care to explain." "Gladly." Charles gestured for everyone to take their seats. When they were settled, he continued, "Before we address the scheduled agenda, I have an announcement of profound importance to this company and its legacy." He moved to stand beside Emily. 20 years ago, we lost Henry and Eleanor Whitmore in a tragic plane crash. Their daughter, Grace, was also presumed dead. Charles paused, his gaze sweeping the room. That presumption was wrong. All eyes turned to Emily, realization dawning on many faces. "This is Grace Whitmore," Charles stated firmly. "Henry and Eleanor's daughter, rightful heir to the Whitmore legacy and shares in this company." The boardroom erupted in exclamations of shock and disbelief. Susan's voice cut through the chaos. "This is absurd," she declared. "Grace Whitmore died 20 years ago. This woman is Emily Collins, a former flight attendant terminated for theft. A termination you personally handled," Charles noted. "Just as you personally arranged for 8-year-old Grace to disappear after the crash," Susan laughed. But the sound was brittle. "You can't possibly expect the board to believe this fantasy based on a physical resemblance." "Not on resemblance," Emily spoke for the first time, her voice steady. "On evidence." At Charles's nod, his assistant distributed folders to each board member. Inside, you'll find DNA results confirming Emily's identity as Grace Whitmore, testimony from Dr. William Garner about the Whitmore birthmark she bears, and statements from the adoption agency acknowledging improper procedures in her placement. The executives flipped through the documents. Expressions growing grave, Susan reached for her folder with visibly trembling hands. "This proves nothing about how my parents died," Emily continued, addressing the room. "But this does." She nodded to Charles, who activated the boardroom's display screen. The security footage from Henry's plane filled the screen. Sean Matthews sabotaging the fuel line. Susan handing him an envelope. The room fell into stunned silence. Susan shot to her feet. "This video is a fake, an obvious fabrication. It was recorded by Henry himself," Charles countered. "Uploaded to a secure server moments before the flight. The credentials were hidden in Grace's medallion, which she's worn every day since the crash." Emily stepped forward, facing Susan directly. "You killed my parents. You tried to erase me. And when fate brought me back to National Airways, you fabricated a theft charge to get rid of me before I could discover the truth." Susan's composure cracked completely. "You're just like your father," she spat. "Self-righteous, blind to what was right in front of him. I loved Henry for years before Eleanor swept in with her perfect face and perfect background." Gasps echoed through the boardroom. Susan seemed beyond caring, years of carefully constructed control disintegrating. "It wasn't supposed to be fatal," she continued, her voice rising. "Just enough to scare him, to make him realize how much he needed me. Eleanor wasn't supposed to be on that plane, but she was," Emily said quietly, "and they both died. That wasn't my fault." Susan's eyes darted around wildly. Sean was the one who miscalculated. He assured me it would just be an emergency landing. The boardroom doors burst open, revealing 2 FBI agents flanked by security. "Susan Donovan," one announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice." Susan's face transformed with rage. With surprising speed, she lunged across the table toward Emily, a letter opener from the table clutched in her hand. "You should have stayed dead," she screamed. Emily recoiled, but before Susan could reach her, another figure interceded. Sean Matthews, who had been waiting outside to give testimony, burst into the room and grabbed Susan's arm. "Enough!" he shouted, wresting the makeshift weapon from her grasp. "It's over, Susan." Security and FBI agents swarmed forward, restraining Susan as she continued to struggle and shout accusations. "You're betraying me too," she snarled at Sean. "After everything we did together." "What we did was wrong," Sean replied, his face haggard. "I've lived with it for 20 years, and I can't anymore." He turned to the FBI agents. "I came here voluntarily. I'm prepared to give a full confession." As Susan was led away, still hurling threats and accusations, the boardroom fell into shocked silence. Emily stood rooted to the spot. Overwhelmed by the violence of Susan's reaction and the sudden culmination of 20 years of hidden truth, Charles stepped beside her, his steady presence anchoring her. "Are you all right?" Emily nodded slowly. "I think I will be." She turned to address the stunned board members. "I apologize for this dramatic introduction. It wasn't how I hoped to meet you all." An older executive, Peterson, according to his nameplate, cleared his throat. "No apology necessary, Ms. Whitmore. The shock is considerable, but the evidence speaks for itself." He glanced at the others, receiving nods of agreement. "Speaking for the board, we welcome you back to your rightful place in this company." Another member spoke up. "What happens now?" Charles looked to Emily, deferring to her. "Justice happens," she said simply. "For my parents and for myself after that." She touched her medallion thoughtfully. "After that, we rebuild. My father built this company on integrity and compassion. It's time to return to those values." The meeting adjourned shortly after, with arrangements made for an emergency press conference later that day. As executives filed out, many stopped to express condolences and amazement at Emily's story. When they were finally alone, Emily sank into a chair, the adrenaline of confrontation draining away. "I never imagined she would react so violently," she said. 20 years of deception, about to come crashing down. Charles replied, sitting beside her. She saw her entire, carefully constructed life disappearing. Emily was quiet for a moment. "What she said about loving my father was obsession, not love," Charles finished gently. "Henry saw it, which is why he installed those cameras. He suspected someone was targeting him, though I don't think even he imagined Susan would go so far." Emily gazed out at the Atlanta skyline, at the planes taking off and landing in the distance. "It's strange. Part of me has hated flying all these years without knowing why. Those nightmares of falling through the sky, they were my subconscious trying to warn me." Charles reached over, hesitantly taking her hand. "And now, Emily said, squeezing his hand. "I think it's time to reclaim the sky, to honor my parents by finishing what they started." Outside, a passenger jet soared upward, catching the afternoon sun on its wings. Emily watched it climb, feeling not fear but a profound sense of rightness, as if after 20 years of being earthbound, she too was finally ready to soar. 6 months after the dramatic boardroom confrontation, National Airways was transformed. The corporate offices buzzed with renewed energy and purpose. Employees who had once feared Susan Donovan's arbitrary judgments now worked in an environment that valued integrity and compassion. Emily, now legally Emily Grace Whitmore Collins, honoring both her birth and adoptive families, stood at the window of what had once been her father's office. The Atlanta skyline spread before her, golden in the late afternoon light. "Contemplating your kingdom?" Charles asked, entering with 2 cups of coffee. Emily smiled, accepting the cup. "Contemplating change. The rebranding launches tomorrow." "Nervous?" "A little," she admitted. "It's a significant departure from the National Airways people know." The company's rebranding had been Emily's first major initiative as the newly appointed chief ethics officer. After considerable research into her father's original vision, she had proposed returning to the name Henry had initially wanted, Wings of the Heart Airlines, complete with a new logo incorporating the wing and heart motif from her medallion. "Your father would be proud," Charles said, joining her at the window. "Not just of the name, but of everything you've accomplished." Emily's gaze traveled to the framed photographs now adorning her office walls. Henry and Eleanor on their wedding day, 8-year-old Grace sitting on her father's shoulders, and a new addition, Margaret and Robert Collins, her adoptive parents, whose love had sustained her through the years of not knowing her true identity. "I hope so," she said softly. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, keeping one foot in each world. Whitmore and Collins. It's who you are," Charles replied. "Both shaped you." A knock at the door interrupted them. Jake Collins, Emily's adoptive brother, now the company's new head of community outreach, poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but the memorial site architects are here with the final plans." Emily nodded. "Send them in." The creation of a memorial at the crash site had been another of Emily's priorities. Not a mournful monument, but a place of reflection and hope. A garden with 20 years of growth, representing how tragedy could, eventually, give way to new life. As the meeting progressed, Emily found herself watching Charles. In the months since discovering her true identity, their relationship had evolved from reluctant allies to trusted partners in rebuilding her father's legacy. There was something more growing between them too, something neither had explicitly acknowledged, but both increasingly felt. After the architects departed, Charles lingered. "Everything looks ready for tomorrow's ceremony." "Almost everything," Emily replied. "There's one more thing I want to do before the official relaunch." The private hangar at Atlanta International Airport housed a single aircraft, the first to bear the new Wings of the Heart livery. Its gleaming fuselage reflected the sunset in hues of gold and crimson. Emily approached it slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the medallion she still wore. Charles walked beside her, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently. Emily nodded. 20 years ago, my parents' plane went down, and my life changed forever. I need to face that fear, reclaim the sky on my terms." Charles understood perfectly. He'd arranged for this private flight, just the two of them and a trusted pilot, to fly over the crash site, now transformed into the memorial garden. Inside the aircraft, Emily settled into her seat, fighting the familiar anxiety that had plagued her for years. As the engines hummed to life, she closed her eyes, memories washing over her. Not the terrifying crash nightmares, but earlier, happier moments, flying with her father in his small plane, his steady hands showing her how the controls worked, her mother's laughter as they soared through cotton candy clouds. "You're smiling," Charles observed as the plane taxied toward the runway. "I'm remembering the good parts," Emily replied, "before everything went wrong." The takeoff was smooth, the pilot skilled and gentle in his ascent. As they climbed, Emily's grip on the armrest gradually relaxed. The sprawl of Atlanta receded beneath them, buildings becoming miniature, roads mere threads connecting tiny points of light. "It's beautiful," she whispered, face pressed to the window. Charles watched her, his expression softening. "You look like him when you do that. That same sense of wonder Henry always had about flying." Emily turned to him. "Tell me more about him. About them. Not as business partners or victims, but as people. The everyday things I've forgotten." As the plane leveled off, Charles shared stories. Henry's terrible jokes that made everyone groan, Eleanor's insistence on fresh flowers in every room, their unwavering commitment to treating every employee with dignity. Emily drank in these details, filling gaps in her fragmentary memories. "We're approaching the memorial site," the pilot announced over the intercom. Emily looked down. In the fading daylight, she could make out the distinctive heart-shaped garden, paths forming delicate wings extending from its center. Lights were being installed for the next day's dedication ceremony, giving the design an ethereal glow against the darkening landscape. "It's perfect," she said, tears welling in her eyes. Beautiful but not mournful, life continuing. Charles reached across, taking her hand. Henry used to say that the true measure of a life wasn't its length but its impact. By that standard, your parents lived extraordinarily well. As did Margaret, Emily added. She taught me that family is more than blood. They circled the memorial once more before turning back toward Atlanta. As the city lights came into view again, Emily realized something remarkable. The anxiety that had accompanied flying for as long as she could remember had dissipated. In its place was a sense of peace, of rightness. Would you think it strange? She said suddenly. If I took flying lessons, Charles smiled. Not strange at all. It's in your blood. The plane descended smoothly toward the runway. As the wheels touched down with a gentle bump, Emily felt a sense of completion, a circle closing after 20 years. In the terminal, as they waited for their car, Charles turned to her. There's something I've been meaning to show you. I was waiting for the right moment. From his pocket, he withdrew a photograph, old and slightly faded around the edges. 3 people stood in front of a small plane: Henry, Charles, and a very pregnant Eleanor. This was taken the day Henry asked me to be your godfather, Charles explained. He said that if anything ever happened to them, he wanted me to look after you, to guide you until you could fly on your own. Emily's breath caught. You're my godfather. Charles nodded. I've struggled with telling you, given how our relationship has evolved. I wasn't sure if it would make things awkward between us. Emily studied the photograph, then looked up at Charles, seeing him with new clarity, not just as her father's friend or her ally in discovering the truth, but as someone who had been meant to be part of her life all along. It doesn't make things awkward, she said softly. It makes them make sense. The next morning, hundreds gathered for the duel ceremony, the dedication of the memorial garden, and the official relaunch of Wings of the Heart Airlines. Emily stood at the podium, Charles beside her, as she addressed the assembled crowd of employees, board members, and media. 20 years ago, a terrible act born of obsession and jealousy took my parents from this world and stole my identity, she began. But today isn't about that darkness. It's about the light that followed, the Collins family who raised me with love, the truth that eventually came to light, and the legacy my birth parents left that can now continue. She gestured to the newly painted fleet of aircraft behind her. Wings of the Heart was my father's original vision for this airline. Not just a means of transportation, but a company with compassion and integrity at its core. Today, we return to that vision. As Emily cut the ceremonial ribbon, the medallion at her throat caught the morning sunlight, casting heart-shaped reflections across the podium. Later, as guests mingled, Emily found herself standing with Charles at the edge of the celebration, watching as Jake charmed a group of investors with his plans for the company's community initiatives. So, Charles said quietly, what comes next for Emily Grace Whitmore Collins? Emily smiled, touching the medallion that had carried her father's secret safely for 20 years. I'm going to live the life they all wanted for me, both my families, and, she added, taking Charles's hand in hers, I'm going to do it with the people who helped me find my way back to myself, above them. The first official Wings of the Heart flight took off, banking gracefully into the cloudless blue sky. Not an ending, but a new beginning. 20 years in the making.